So 2025 is going to be an interesting year for Linux because there are some details about certain things that could potentially be announced that could actually create some strives as far as the adoption of Linux as an operating system. So I guess let's start off with Valve. So Valve in 2022 released the Steam Deck, and the Steam Deck has an operating system that's based on Linux, and a lot of people kind of saw that as like a huge step for Linux potentially becoming more adapted, more expanded in general, and that kind of did happen. I do think that the Steam Deck being based on Linux definitely did incentivize a lot of developers for, at the very least, make sure that it's the deck approved a lot of their games, and there's actually some like minor guidelines that you can follow for making sure that your game will probably run well on the deck. Usually there's not really a ton of work that you actually need to do in order to make the game work on Linux because so much of the work is already done with the translation layers. But, just little minor things like, for example, maybe don't rely on fucking Windows Media Foundation bullshit. Stuff like that. But yeah, but 2025, we're kind of seeing like a similar thing here because um, Valve seems to be doing something similar that Meta is doing. So if you don't know, Meta is actually intending to expand on the operating system that runs under MetaQuest devices because, for a long time, the operating system was pretty much exclusively available on their MetaQuest device. I would say Rift, but I forgot that Rift doesn't even fucking have, like, it's not even a standalone device. It's basically just a remote rendering device. But the MetaQuest devices, they do actually have an operating system. I believe it's based on Android running on it. And so they do want to make this OS sort of available for other OEMs that want to create VR devices to use it. And I think Valve is doing something kind of similar here, in which they want the SteamOS operating system to serve a very similar purpose. And the thing is, if something like that were to happen, I actually do believe it would expand the adoption of Linux in general, simply due to the fact that consoles in general, like just video game consoles in general, they're usually not profitable in and of itself. Like I think the Nintendo Switch might be the only true console that actually doesn't, like, at least to some degree, it makes back its money through sales. But like other video game consoles like the PlayStation 5, the Xbox Series X, like these consoles are usually sold at a loss. How they primarily make their money is through people buying first party or even third party games that are licensed for those consoles. And with the Steam Deck, I wouldn't be able to tell you whether or not those things are sold at a loss, but it is definitely, a bit of a shaky market for them to get into, especially when at the end of the day, Valve, it's really their store that gives them money. Not, I wouldn't imagine it's the Steam Deck alone. It's the sales of the Steam Deck that allows them to do that. I always kind of seen the Steam Deck as just a device that Valve can sort of rely on if they can no longer trust Microsoft to be like their hub for PC gaming. And so they want to have their own dedicated devices that people can somewhat, that they can at least control. And not be dependent on Microsoft. At least that's how I've always interpreted, and that's cool. But if they're the only ones manufacturing the devices, they basically have to make it profitable, and which is not always ideal. And then there's also the fact that at least the mentality that Valve seems to be having right now is they're only really gonna release new variants of the Steam Deck whenever there's like a big leap in technology. It's kind of similar to video game consoles, which is nice. But the thing is, the world of PC gaming tends to be very like it tends to be very fast as far as like technology advancing. Like if you look at, for example, other handheld manufacturers, they usually release like new models that tend to have like upgraded GPUs and CPUs and stuff like that, which it kind of allows them to be ahead of Valve. Not to say that their handheld devices are necessarily better than the Steam Deck as far as how intuitive they are, because they usually also tend to have issues with battery life. But it is definitely like an attractive thing to have like a handheld that's theoretically not even theoretically, like legitimately more powerful than the Steam Deck. Like that's a pretty fucking strong marketing point, and a lot of those handheld devices tend to have Windows as the operating system, and I think that if Valve is able to convince a lot of these OEMs to have the SteamOS, which in some ways does actually have some advantages over Microsoft Windows, simply due to the fact that Microsoft Windows in general is just like I'm gonna be completely honest with you, that OS is just not really good with mobile devices in general. Like with laptop, I feel like they've been in the business for long enough that they can kind of wiggle around the use case of it, just kind of tune the kernel to work kind of as it's supposed to on laptops. But on handhelds, it's even more complicated. And there's also some issues with like sleep and suspend and stuff like that. All things that SteamOS just doesn't have. And these are like one of the things that makes the SteamOS in general just kind of a little more attractive for handhelds. Obviously, there's the issue of game compatibility, but honestly, I wouldn't even say it's like as much of a big issue as you may think it is because compatibility is getting better, and we're kind of at a point in time when the majority of games that don't work on Linux are ones that have like anti-cheat and stuff like that. But honestly, well, a lot of these competitive games, would you even want to play on a handheld anyway? Like, if you would you even want to play stuff like Call of Duty, fucking Rainbow Six Siege? Are these even the kinds of games you would play on a Steam Deck? Wouldn't you want to play them on a mouse and keyboard? If that makes any sense. Not to say that I don't think these games need to work on the Steam Deck, because I do think they do. It would be very good if we were able to come up with a solution for a lot of these games that tend to have kernel anti-cheats, but that's easier said than done because at the end of the day, a lot of the main reasons for why these anti-cheats don't work, at least the kernel level ones, is because well, it's not even so much that they don't work. These anti-cheats usually do have some degree of support for Linux. I think it's more so that the scale to which the anti-cheat monitors your device tends to be uh ring zero kernel mode, and the problem is that these anti-cheats are designed for Windows, and Windows has a different kernel than Linux. And then there's also the fact that Proton can only run in user mode, in user space. It can't really run in kernel mode, and so yeah, it's a very complicated scenario. And then there's also the fact that even if these companies did release like native builds of these anti-cheat softwares, where a lot of Linux users even accept those, because I personally wouldn't. I don't fucking accept any kernel level anti-cheat on any of my fucking operating systems. And is it even really all that worth it to maintain those when the market is Linux gamers in general isn't really that big? That's kind of the situation that kind of makes this really complicated. But I like to believe that with Lenovo Legion potentially having SteamOS, we can see here with this fucking. Uh, I don't know if you guys can see it here, but I'll zoom in a little bit. There's the Steam logo here, which indicates that it might ship out with SteamOS, which I think is good. I know you can install Bazzite, but like these are like third-party alternative solutions for integrating SteamOS. But like this is a case where these things are actually shipping with the operating system running on the Steam Deck by default, which for normies, that's a good thing. I think it's gonna help. Now the thing is, I think all of this is nice. I think all of this is cool. Uh, I'll bring this up in a few minutes, but I think all of this is nice, and I do think that it could potentially end up increasing the overall just overall adoption of Linux, overall support of Linux. But do I think that we'll ever see like the year of Linux desktop or anything like that? So, in my opinion, I do believe the Linux over time is going to get better, but I don't necessarily think it's ever going to get to a point where it's competing with Windows, at least in my personal opinion. And a lot of that really has very little to do with me necessarily believing that Linux isn't ready. I think Linux has been ready for a long time. I think Linux has been a pretty viable desktop operating system for a long time. The issue is with the software support. Is that if you're someone that, relies on certain pieces of program, relies on certain peripherals that require certain drivers and stuff like that, you tend to be beholden to these companies to actually release software that's compatible with Linux. And a lot of the times, this is just not really the case. And that's a problem, is that these companies, the ISVs, they don't have any incentive to provide software support for Linux because there's just not enough market share. But the problem here is, you know, it becomes a chicken and the egg type of situation where, in order for these software developers to create software for Linux, there needs to be more Linux users. But we're only going to get more Linux users if there's more software support. And so it's an endless loop where nothing gets achieved. And that's a problem. And something else that I think also is going to prevent Linux from truly growing, for example, compared to Android, is also the license. Because Linux is based on GPL. And the thing with GPL is that it's a nice license, it's cool, it's very freedom friendly and stuff like that. But it does have one problem, which is the fact that this license creates a lot of restrictions as far as how controlling someone forking the original software can be. So, for example, one of the things that I feel like is always gonna kind of haunt Linux is copyleft. And the thing about copyleft is basically the way it works. I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but the way it works is if you create a software that's based on, like, in the context of Linux as an example, if you create a piece of software that's based on Linux, the software in question has to be open source, if that makes any sense. Like, you can't, for example, fork Linux and then create a proprietary version of it. Like, you're just not really allowed to do that. You kind of have to give back the contributions that you offer to the software if you're going to fork it. And the problem with here is that basically means that a lot of the big companies, the big tech companies that might be interested, for example, in creating their own operating system, Linux is a good place to start because there's just so much groundwork built from the get-go. But the problem is that a lot of these companies, they're very controlling of their software. Like, the reason why, for example, Android is kind of able to strive is because Android doesn't really have the same license as Linux, in the sense that, a lot of these phone vendors, they will ship Android, but they'll usually also add a lot of their own proprietary software, like kind of merge into the Android code and kind of make their own version of Android. And so a lot of the times, like, in practice, like the Android, like the stock Android that we tend to see on like Samsung phones, LG phones, stuff like that, it's not actually open source. It's proprietary because it has proprietary code in it. And that's not really something that you can easily do with Linux. I think Google was able to find like a weird loophole where it it I think they created was it Chromium OS, and Chromium OS is open source. But then through Chromium OS, they created Chrome OS, and Chrome OS is proprietary. It's just like a weird fucking jumping through hoops kind of bullshit. And I don't know if that many companies really care to do that. Like, Google in general is a company that's very like weird to. It's gonna be weird to say this, but they're actually very welcoming of like open source software in general, and so they don't really mind doing that. But like, for example, if I were to ever imagine like companies like Asus or Lenovo or MSI or fucking, I don't know, Sony decides to create their own desktop operating system, like, I feel like they would want to have like every bit of control over their operating system. And the idea that some of their code has to be open source, it has to be, you know, sort of made public, as in other people can look at it and, fork it for themselves. I think that idea just kind of terrifies them and makes them not really want to do it. And that's why, for example, FreeBSD, which doesn't have copyleft license, uh, you're basically allowed to fork the operating system and make it fully proprietary, which is something that Apple has done. It's something that Sony has done with their PlayStation devices. Uh, that's why, for example, you will see more operating systems based on FreeBSD, because FreeBSD is in this fucking disadvantage. it's advantageous position where you can pretty much take their code and do whatever the fuck you want and not really give back anything. Linux is a lot harder to do that. And it's good in general for the progress of open source development, but in terms of like making this operating system wildly adapted, it's kind of a bottleneck a little bit. And so I don't know. Valve, I guess they're cool with using Linux, and I don't know. It is actually something that I've thought about a lot. Like it's little things like these that I do feel like is always gonna hold back Linux. But then again, I don't think it's actually really that necessary for Linux to be competing with Windows, just because I feel like um I don't really see Linux as a commercial operating system, and so I don't think it really matters all that much if it's like overtaking, competing with all like Apple and Microsoft with their Windows operating system. I think I'm kind of okay with Linux being in this fucking 4% ish market share position, even though I do think that, you know, being like this, it does tend to mean that some programs that I might want to use are not really going to be available on Linux because, you know, it doesn't have enough people. And so, you know, I think it's something that I'm able to deal with it, but it's not all Gucci, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna pay attention to CSS 2025. I think it's gonna be interesting regardless, but um, I also would lower your expectation as far as the future of Linux because I think it's gonna be better, but I don't think it's gonna like dramatically become all that much better. But yeah, anyway, that's all I have to share.